Thank you very much, Kelsey, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Certainly a pleasure to talk about this topic, which is quite interesting to me, and I hope that it'll be interesting to you. I look forward to any questions at the end if I don't cover something that interests you. First, I want to disclose that I am a paid medical advisor for the company. My opinions don't necessarily reflect those of Douglas Laboratories. So most of you, if not all of you, are here today because you're interested in building muscle or maintaining muscle for performance reasons or for aesthetic reasons. And we're going to discuss HMB as a modality to support those objectives. But first, let's talk about building and maintaining muscle. And there are two types of metabolism, metabolic processes that regulate the amount of muscle that you have. The first is anabolism, and that is the function of building muscle through protein synthesis. And the opposite of that is catabolism, and that's the process in which muscle protein is broken down, usually because the body needs it for fuel. So in order to achieve an increase in muscle mass, you have to shift this equation in favor of anabolism and away from catabolism. So we're going to discuss how you do this and where HMB might fit into that puzzle. We'll also cover protein and amino acids because that is so relevant to this conversation. So when we think about building muscle, we often think dietary protein, and it's absolutely true that amino acids that come from the protein that you eat are critical because they're the structural materials from which muscle is built. But like building a house, there has to be a builder on site, and the builder coordinates the assembly of those materials. And if that builder's not there, then the materials just sit in a pile. So in muscle cells, that builder or that contractor is called the ribosome. And the ribosome is this organelle that orchestrates the synthesis of protein from amino acids. So the amino acids are the raw materials, and the ribosome is the coordinator, the assembler of those amino acids to create a structure, and that structure is muscle protein. Nutritionally, there are ways that you can manipulate this process of anabolism. First, you have to deliver the amino acid precursors through dietary protein. You can also take supplements containing essential amino acids. And then you can turn on the ribosome through certain specific amino acids and their metabolites, which we'll touch on in a moment. So many of you may have tried a high protein diet or increasing protein and experimenting in that in the sense that you really want to see what it does to your muscle mass. And if you've ever done that and you haven't really noticed a big increase in lean body mass, it's probably because your body took a lot of those amino acids and used them for energy. And that's essential to health and homeostasis. In fact, we wouldn't be around today. Humans simply would never have survived food shortages and famines if we didn't have the ability to break down our own muscle for energy. It's quick energy. It's not like fat, which is slow burning. Muscle can be used for quick energy. And the process by which that protein is broken down is catabolism, as we mentioned earlier. So why do we enter a catabolic state? Why do we lose our muscle mass? Well, you might not have enough raw materials. You might not have enough protein available. You also might be overtraining from a volume perspective. If you're engaging in long duration endurance workouts that are several hours per day, you're probably burning a lot of energy. And if you're not compensating for that through increased protein and calorie intake, then you're probably using muscle for fuel. You also might be catabolic if you do high intensity interval training first thing in the morning before eating anything. If you're out of glycogen from an overnight fast and you have not eaten anything and you need quick burning fuel, you're not going to be using fat when you're doing your uphill sprints. You're going to be using muscle mass. So you can be perfectly healthy and enter a catabolic state. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to be catabolic all day. You can be subsequently much more anabolic after high intensity interval training for several hours just because you did that training. And that probably would compensate for any loss that occurred during the workout. Another reason why we can be catabolic is that builder, that assembler is just not working well. The ribosome isn't working well. And that occurs as we get older. We just can't make as much protein as we did when we were younger because of many factors that we'll touch on in a moment. But one of those is the ribosome just is getting lazy and it doesn't do as nearly as good a job taking dietary protein and making it work for you. So what causes a catabolic state? This is a huge area of metabolic and nutrition research. As I mentioned earlier, the low calorie, low protein intake factor matters a lot. When it comes to losing muscle, that's the first thing you want to look at. When you're breaking down muscle for fuel because you're not giving enough fuel through your diet, then you're going to lose lean body mass. This occurs as part of aging. Aging involves a 1 to 2% muscle mass loss per year after age 50. It might be as much as 3% after age 60. It depends on the individual. It depends on your lifestyle, your overall health status. Depends on your diet, depends on protein intake. But in general, there is at least a 1% reduction per year in lean body mass after age 50. That process can begin as early as age 30. So it all depends on individual genetics and other factors. Part of the aging process involves a hormonal decline, and not just the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, but the anabolic hormones, growth hormone, and insulin-like growth factor 1. And IGF-1 is probably the most anabolic hormone your body makes. It's turned on by insulin. And if your insulin sensitivity goes down, which it typically does to some extent with aging, it also goes down with unhealthy lifestyle and diet choices, then your anabolic response is not going to be nearly as high. Estrogen is also anabolic in a sense. That's something that is often unrecognized in these conversations. But when women go through menopause, they typically lose quite a bit of lean body mass just through that transition. And that is because their estrogen levels precipitously decline. Stress obviously can cause loss of lean body mass through the increase in cortisol, which is a catabolic hormone. Inflammation is another cause. Inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha and interleukin-6 are catabolic. It's one of the reasons why you see a loss of lean body mass associated with chronic health conditions. And finally, if you've ever had an injury and you haven't been able to exercise, you know what happens to whatever the muscle is that you're immobilizing, it shrinks. So obviously, atrophy occurs as part of disuse, and general immobilization obviously is going to cause loss of lean body mass. Usually it's a local phenomenon, not systemic, but we all know, most of us know what that's like. So I'm showing you these two pictures of these organelles in muscle cells that regulate what happens to the protein that you eat and whether that protein that's already been incorporated into muscle tissue gets degraded. So on the left, that's a ribosome, and that's what builds the protein. Nutritionally, you want to activate that structure. You want to get it to work better. And you can do that with dietary leucine and HMB, which we'll talk about. You also want to inhibit another structure called the proteasome, which degrades muscle protein. As we age, and this applies to athletes who are getting older, anyone who has been around for enough time, and even if they are exercising, just part of the natural aging process involves a reduction in ribosomal activity and also an increase in proteasomal activity. So nutritionally, the goal is to activate the ribosome and inhibit the proteasome. So how do you do that? There's an amino acid called leucine. Most of you have probably heard this in the sense that it's one of the branched chain amino acids. And if you've ever taken a BCAA supplement, leucine is one of the three. It's also an essential amino acid, which means that your body can't make this compound. You have to obtain it from food. So there have been many studies on leucine, mainly because it's very, very attractive as an activator of the ribosome. And we know, based on lots of preclinical studies, that it's a direct activator of a very well-known signaling pathway called mTOR, which activates the ribosome, which increases protein synthesis. And at the same time, it's anti-catabolic. It can reduce the rate of muscle protein degradation. So all of these facts taken together explain why it's so well researched with regard to muscle wasting and other conditions that involve the skeletal muscle and ways to maintain it. The leucine is extensively metabolized to a metabolite called KIC, which in part mediates some of its effects. And then the KIC is converted to ketones, which are not anabolic, not really anti-catabolic. I would say this axis does play a role in the mechanism of action, but more importantly, leucine is metabolized to a compound called HMB. However, only 5% of it generates HMB. So HMB is the major anti-catabolic metabolite of leucine. As we age, our ability to make this conversion decreases. HMB is present in certain foods, but in very, very low amounts. So leucine is certainly important in the diet. Most people get about 6 grams of leucine per day. You would have to get 60 grams of leucine in order to produce the 3 grams of HMB that has been tested in clinical trials and shown to be effective. So clearly HMB is a superior choice, although you should make sure you get enough leucine in your diet. Some experts recommend about 55 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day of leucine, which for a 70 kilogram athlete would be about 4 grams of leucine per day. And when we get to the end of the talk, I'll give you a couple of ideas on how to meet that requirement. First, let's talk about the studies that have been done on HMB. Over 200 scientific studies and scholarly reviews on HMB have been published since the year 2000. I will go through a couple of noteworthy examples of some of these findings. Of course, not all of the studies have shown that HMB is effective in athletes, but some of the more remarkable results are shown here. A 27% increase in strength was reported over a 4-week period in young adults engaged in moderate exercise programs. And I like to touch on how long it takes for supplements to work when I give educational seminars, just simply because it's something that you're probably interested in, and anybody who consults you with regard to their nutrition plan will probably want to know this. A minimum of 4 weeks. So allow at least 4 weeks to go by, better yet 12 weeks. And the results that you will see on this slide, the 27%, typically I don't really see that kind of effect size in most of the studies. So it's not like that's the typical response. I would say that is quite high for an HMB product to work at a 27% increase in strength in such a short amount of time. Gaining lean mass takes time, so be patient. HMB is not going to work right away. A 1.4 kilogram gain of lean mass is not something that you would be able to look in the mirror and immediately tell that someone gained that amount. But it's something, and it was statistically significant, and a 4-week time period is pretty reasonable. There was also a loss of body fat in that study, which has been shown by other authors. So age groups right now in this slide, we're looking at 20 to 40-year-olds, but HMB research spans all age groups, all adult age groups. And a lot of the studies have been done on elderly subjects, individuals with sarcopenia and other catabolic conditions. And most of the studies on those types of conditions show that HMB is quite effective. This study was done on 42 highly trained male combat athletes, very experienced athletes, and they received HMB for 12 weeks. And there was a 11% increase in lean mass, as well as a 30% decrease in fat mass. So both were statistically significant compared to placebo. So clearly there is a positive effect on body composition. This study showed an 11% increase in lean mass, 18% increase in strength. So we're not just talking about muscle mass, we're talking about functional strength. I'm sure that applies to lots of you who are listening in right now. This was a 12-week study. Resistance trained men were the subjects here. So a lot of these studies used previously trained individuals. Some of them used novice, they recruited novice athletes. And in both cases, HMB was effective. So we've been talking about strength and size. What about aerobic performance? What about endurance athletes? This study involved endurance athletes. This was a study of trained cyclists that revealed improvements in VO2 max after just 2 weeks of HMB supplementation. So this is one of several studies showing that yes, it can certainly support VO2 max and aerobic performance gains. A reduction in blood lactate accumulation was also statistically significant. Mixed performance involving aerobic and anaerobic parameters may also support HMB as being effective and useful. 16 elite male rowers were studied here. A 12-week period of supplementation was associated with increased time to exhaustion, so less fatigue. Also increased maximum weight load and increased anaerobic peak power, all of which are critical for rowing as well as other sports. So whether your sport involves strength, power, or endurance, HMB might fit into your protocol quite nicely. In the last 20 years, over 20 clinical trials have supported the efficacy of HMB. As far as dosage goes, most of these studies have used 3 to 6 grams per day. I like to recommend 3 grams per day. Most of the studies do support somewhere between 1.5 and 6 if you look at the sports nutrition studies. Generally, the findings have been consistent with respect to muscle mass and strength. Lots of studies have looked at lean mass in healthy elderly and those who are in a catabolic state. Quite a lot of research does focus on those catabolic conditions, which I didn't go into today, but it does lend further support for the utility of HMB in athletes who are in a catabolic state. And recall from the earlier slide that I presented, you can be in a catabolic state if you're not eating enough, also if you're overtraining, or if you're on the brink of overtraining. If your volume and intensity is high enough that you're losing some muscle, and you might not know it. So that's another point that I want to make. It doesn't hurt to try this, and if you're going to try it, give it 3 months. 3 months, and if you do measure body comp, that's probably the best way to assess whether it's working for you or not. You can also use functional strength outputs like bench press and squats, and look at your strength before and after the supplementation period if you're able to be a true guinea pig and try to keep everything else steady so you can assess whether or not the HMB is working. But clearly the evidence does support efficacy in athletes. The mechanism of action, as I mentioned, it increases the ribosomal activity, it reduces proteasomal activity, much in the way that leucine does. But HMB is the active metabolite of leucine. So supplementing with HMB does make more sense than supplementing with leucine. And my main reason for saying that is that most Americans get about 6 grams of leucine per day, which is more than enough. If you only need 4 if you weigh 70 kilograms. How does HMB fit in a general protocol, a sports nutrition protocol? These are my 4 favorite products: protein, creatine, BCAA, and HMB, mainly because they have stood the test of time. I've been following sports nutrition now for more than 2 decades. And these are the only supplements as far as the non-nutritional, the non-essential vitamins and minerals. These are the supplements that work. So if you really want to simplify your nutritional protocol and really focus on what works, it should be these 4 products, provided that all of your vitamins and minerals, your vitamin D, your omegas, your probiotics are all in place. If you've got that strong foundation and you want to add something for performance, whether it's for size, strength, aesthetics, this is what you should really focus on. So there are complementary mechanisms, just coming full circle from the first slide. Protein and the essential amino acids, there are 9 of them. I'll talk about those in a minute. Those are mainly anabolic. Creatine is also anabolic. Creatine is not really anti-catabolic. So these are anabolic. And then on the other side of the equation, you have catabolism. How do you mitigate catabolism? You can use BCAA, which contains leucine. You can also use whey protein, which is a great source of leucine, as well as BCAA. when you take whey protein, those amino acids are bound by peptide bonds, and that makes them more rapidly absorbed, not necessarily more effective. But post-workout, whey protein is a very good source of fast absorption amino acids, as well as leucine. HMB obviously is anti-catabolic. It's also technically also anabolic, but most of the research looks at the catabolic side of things. So dividing these 4 nutritional components into a very simple protocol. This is very simple, however, it's in a way appropriate for even the most advanced athletes who just want something that combines evidence-based ingredients into a simple daily protocol. So protein, generally you want to hit 1.2 to 2.0 grams per kilogram per day. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and Dietitians of Canada and the American College of Sports Medicine recommend this amount per kilogram body weight per day. So some people might find it difficult to hit 2 grams per kilogram. Others might not have any trouble with that, but it's something you just want to track. You don't necessarily have to count all of your macros, but you should get a sense, at least on an intermittent basis, approximately how much protein you're consuming per day and trying to hit that number. And the best time of day to take protein is obviously at each meal. If you eat 3 meals a day, you might want to add another. 4 meals per day containing protein is probably your best bet. Pre and post workout are also great times to take protein, as well as before bed. There have been studies in which protein was given before bed, and there were increases in muscle mass compared to individuals who did not follow that procedure before bed. Because you are catabolic at night. It's perfectly normal to be catabolic at night, but you can help offset that, at least for a little while, if you supplement with protein. Creatine is obviously a staple in any strength and power application, but it can also help endurance athletes. Typical dosing is 5 grams per day. You might want to experiment with higher doses if you are a serious strength and power athlete. At least occasionally go up to 10 grams for a few days, and you'll probably notice an increase in strength, at least temporarily. Best time of day is to take it with carbohydrates, and there are some lines of evidence that support its utility after a workout, because your muscles are more responsive to creatine after a workout. They're also more responsive to protein and carbohydrates. So it's the so-called anabolic window that occurs within the first 90 to 120 minutes following a training session that you want to capitalize on. The third nutrient that is a mainstay of sports nutrition in any application, regardless of your sport, is BCAA. General dosing is 3 to 6 grams per day. 3 grams, I would say, would be sufficient for most individuals, and the time at which that would be most effective would be before, during, or after workouts, or all 3. You can mix it in a water bottle, take it with you to your workout, and sip on it throughout the workout and finish it at the end. It's typically what I find most pretty easy to do, pretty easy habit to get used to. HMB fits in nicely. It's just a 3 gram per day dose, divided doses anytime. You don't have to take this pre or post. There's no specific time of day, whatever's convenient for you. Often it's easier to remember if you take it with food. So let's just summarize what we talked about today. HMB is effective in offsetting catabolism. It also supports anabolism as the major active metabolite of leucine, which is an anabolic amino acid. It works best with some kind of concurrent physiological stress, like hard training, or if you're in a catabolic state because of some other reason. Let's say you're dieting or you're trying to lose body fat, you're not getting enough calories, you might want to consider HMB because it can help to mitigate some of that catabolism that's going on. And then efficacy in strength and endurance applications has been shown throughout an expanding evidence base that began in the late 90s and has evolved quite nicely with consistent lines of evidence, not only in sports, but in the elderly and other conditions. So HMB has a very unique mechanism of action. It modifies the ribosome and the proteasome activity, and that's very distinct and complementary to protein and amino acid supplements. And amino acids are very important, obviously. We have this new product, it's clean essential amino acids plus HMB. There are 9 essential amino acids. This product gives you the HMB as well as an amino acid blend that has been studied in elderly individuals and in young subjects, showing an increase in muscle protein synthesis measured by the fractional synthetic rate. That's just one of the ways that they look at the synthesis of muscle protein. So this is a very leucine rich formula, which is one of the things I like about it. 1.2 milligrams of leucine per day. That's a pretty good amount. That will give you about 25% of what you need in a day if you weigh 70 kilograms. And if you use whey protein like clean isolate, that's going to give you another 2 grams of leucine. So if you combine both the whey protein and this product in one day, that brings you to 80% of your daily leucine requirements based on current recommendations. And that doesn't include the food you're taking in. So you're definitely bumping up your leucine intake, and you're also providing HMB. So with that, I'd just like to thank you, and we'll get to questions.